Good afternoon, everyone. I am Patricia Alba, Assistant Director of Communications and Work Life here at UFHR. And today we are joined by John Redenberg. I hope I pronounced your last name correctly, John.
Very
Uh,
good.
Great. He's a UF Health Jacksonville registered dietitian, and he's been a diabetes educator for quite a couple of years now, I think. So he's going to talk to us about how to live well with diabetes. As we go through the presentation, if you have questions, please drop them in the chat and we'll answer them at the end of the presentation. Um, this webinar is being recorded and we'll upload it on our YouTube channel, so you can always reference back to it if you want to go back and get more information. So with that said, John, the floor is yours.
All right. Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here, and what better time to talk about food than what might be lunchtime for some of you. So we are going to spend the next, several minutes or so, however much time we have together, talking about a very important topic, especially for persons with diabetes, and that is food. Understanding some of the nutrition guidelines as it relates to persons with diabetes, but also how to make informed decisions in the supermarket. And when we look at the context of everything we want to discuss today, it's not just specific to individuals with diabetes. So people on this call may or may not even have diabetes. I've been living with diabetes myself since I was a kid, and I've been a dietitian and diabetes educator for almost 30 years now. So I've seen a lot. I've witnessed a lot of changes, but one thing is still constant, and that is food rules when it comes to overall effective blood sugar management. And one of the take-home messages you'll see is that there isn't really one single approach that works for everybody. It's all about trying to find the best plan for you that you can sustain, and most importantly, still like your life. Food is a very big part of who we are and what we do. So trying to adhere to very rigid nutrition guidelines usually is a recipe for not long-term success. So at the end of our session, I want to make sure I have at least three key objectives covered. I want to make sure you understand how our different macros, that we often hear them called, affect our blood sugar, your protein, your fat, and of course your carbohydrate. Also want to make sure you recognize the role of portion control in managing diabetes. There's a lot of discussions about portion control in more broad terms, but I want to try to drill it down to some more practical ideas of conveying real food choices with, suitable portion sizes to help persons with diabetes live a healthy and happy life. And then also spend some time looking at the key components of a food label. Grocery stores are very tricky. They've got tens of thousands of food items they want you to buy, and what you'll understand is most of those labeling terms are just marketing, but there's very valuable pieces of information in there. So I'm going to try to help you identify some key things to look at when you're examining a food label, but also help you understand that you don't need to get overwhelmed at what's going on there. So starting off, if we look at eating right, so to speak, with diabetes, every year the American Diabetes Association comes up with guidelines for healthcare providers for diabetes education and diabetes self-management. And the nutrition chapter, oftentimes each year when it's renewed, has the same recurring themes, and you see them right there on the screen. The goals, according to the guidelines, are trying to promote healthy eating patterns with lots of nutritious foods, foods that are rich in vitamins and minerals and dietary fiber. Those guidelines should also address individual nutrition needs. So a person also needs to monitor their blood pressure or their cholesterol. That's what eating right with diabetes would look like for that person. Of course, we also want to make sure that that approach helps achieve blood sugar goals, as well as a healthy weight and healthy cholesterol levels, but also hidden in those guidelines, tucked away in one of the final statements, is maintaining the pleasure of eating. So again, eating with diabetes should still taste good. Now, some changes are often required because if we look at some of the eating behaviors that may have led somebody to get diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, some changes might definitely be necessary, but ultra restrictive programs really don't work in the long term. And that's where the practical sense comes in. So as I said from the outset, not a single approach to diabetes. There isn't a pre-printed meal plan that I give to patients when it's time to talk about nutrition. There are no special foods. You look in the supermarket and you'll see the diabetic section of foods, and that's not required. And really, if you're a person living with diabetes in a family, the foods that are healthy for you are really healthy for everyone else. So it's all about choosing a meal patterns with foods that you still enjoy, understanding how those foods can impact your blood sugar, and then also moving towards your goals. So that's it from a practical sense. Now, as we talked about before, if there are questions, feel free to throw them in the chat and I'll get those at the very end. But one of the common things people ask, especially many dietitians, is, okay, look, I understand the guidelines, I see where you're coming from, but if I wanted a good starting point, like if there was a template to follow, what is the best overall diet for diabetes? So there's several diets out there, but when we look at some of the research and look at long range studies and observational studies of certain types of meal plans and how they affect a person's A1C level. So remember that A1C is a good indicator of long-term blood glucose management. There are three diets that actually showed a lot of favorable research. One being the Mediterranean diet. So this is a diet that's largely plant-based. Very little red meat, very little concentrated sweets, plenty of healthy fats and lean cuts of fish and poultry, part of that diet, and of course olive oil, as we said before, healthy fats. The other diet that has shown A1C reduction is the ketogenic diet. So ketogenic, by its name definition, means burning ketones, using ketones as fuel, which typically will occur if you're having very low carbohydrates. So ketogenic diet and a low carbohydrate diet, they have some differences, but they're all very similar. They're using limited amounts of carbohydrates. So those three that are highlighted in blue there have shown in research trials to drive down an individual's A1C level. Other diets, like the DASH diet, which we'll typically use in hypertension management, as well as intermittent fasting, where food choices are constricted to a certain window of time, whether it's 8 to 5 or noon to 6, whatever it might be. These are some of the common approaches that, in all of my years doing diabetes education and counseling, I've seen improvements in persons' health parameters with all five of these approaches. The key, though, is what can be sustained. So the best diet really for diabetes is going to depend on you. It's going to depend on what are your goals. It's going to depend on what are your current eating patterns. Can you sustain the program, and do you enjoy the foods, and are there other conditions that need to be managed? If you're a person living with diabetes who also has elevated cholesterol, well, a ketogenic diet might not be the best approach if your food choices are largely high in saturated fat. That could magnify perhaps some of your lipid issues too. But the other thing that we look at is what other resources and support do you have? Are you a culinary wizard in the kitchen, or do you need something more kind of like a mannequin and a plan type thing? Those are some of the areas that we look at in terms of selecting the best diet for persons with diabetes, which is why sitting down with an expert, such as a registered dietitian or a diabetes educator, is the hallmark of care when we look at initial diagnoses of diabetes. But one of the quotes that I pulled from the latest care guidelines relates to carbohydrate intake. So a lot of attention in diabetes meal planning goes to carbohydrate, and rightfully so. You'll see very soon that it's a nutrient that has the most impact on a person's blood sugar. And what these guidelines are now saying is that they're not clearly advocating a low carb diet, but they are saying that when you reduce your overall carbohydrate intake each day, so the amount of cereals and grains and fruits and such that you're eating, this seems to have the most evidence for improving blood sugar or improving glycemia. So that's a key message to get across. In our practice, we don't advocate a low carb diet, but we do try to be carb smart or carb aware, understanding that these are the foods that have the highest amount of carbohydrate if you're consuming them on a regular basis, we might need to pay close attention to some of the medications that are being used because of their impact on blood sugar. So again, I see some questions popping up in the chat, so we'll get those towards the end. I tend to cover a lot of ground very quickly, and I talk fast, so we'll gladly revisit any key points as we continue to move forward. But when we look at some of the common tools that are used in nutrition education for diabetes, one of them is the exchange list. So the exchange list breaks down food into key categories, just kind of like your old food group thing, your meats and proteins, your grains, your fruits, your vegetables, and gives that individual some numeric guidelines for number of servings from each of those groups. So that's one approach. Another approach is straight carb counting, and this is an approach that actually works very well for persons who are using insulin. So insulin and carbohydrate work together to help get energy into those working muscles. So if you're counting carbs, you'll also be able to adjust your insulin accordingly. And carbohydrate kind of involves, a close study of all the different food choices and understanding which ones contain carbohydrate and what's an appropriate upper limit for you as the patient to have at a meal or a snack. So again, those are some of the common tools that are used in diabetes meal plan, not the only ones, but some of the most common. Another thing that often happens, especially when we look ahead to the type of diabetes, specifically type 2 diabetes, where individuals would need to lose weight or may benefit from weight loss. I found some research done by the National Weight Control Registry. So this is a database of 10,000 people that every year are followed for survey results and behavior modifications that they are doing to see how they're doing with their long-term weight loss. So everyone enrolled in this program has lost significant amount of weight and have been able to keep it off. So that's two very distinctively different things. A lot of us have lost weight before, but have only regained it. This particular group, this registry consists of people who've actually been able to maintain that weight loss. And look at some of their habits. Of course, almost all of them modified their food choices. Almost all of them increased their physical activity, but 75% of them weigh themselves each week, once a week. 62% watch less than 10 hours of TV each week. So you can see some of the behaviors that are common denominators for losing weight. And one of the things that we continue to struggle with is understanding that weight loss is more than just calories in and calories out. So it's a very complex, integrated metabolic equation that we're still beginning to scratch the surface. And through the advent of a lot of our new medications, specifically our GLP-1s, we're finding that a lot of those drives, those hormones that drive us to eat, if we can tamp those down, it makes some of the meal adjustments a lot more easier. Okay, so again, those are some of the things to look at when we look at long range weight loss, but it all comes down to the nutritional intake, and the evidence shows that any meal plan that's going to reduce caloric intake will promote some weight loss. I put on the screen there a chart that shows you some of the common calorie counts, if you will, for our key macronutrients. So the big three: carbohydrates, fat, and protein. So fat is the most energy dense of these macronutrients, but also wanted to put alcohol on there. So alcohol is not a nutrient, but it does provide calories. And alcohol is also a potentially very energy dense nutrient too, and can interfere with blood glucose management because it can tend to suppress blood sugar to a point where it could be somewhat dangerous. So alcohol is something that you have to be very careful with, not just from a weight management standpoint, but also from a diabetes self-management standpoint. So if we look at each of these nutrients and a quick review of what they are and where we find them, and let's face it, most of the foods that we eat are providing us a combination of these macronutrients. So you have your fat, your butter, your oils, your mayonnaise, your cream. If you look at the food labels for these foods, you'll find that just a small amount, like a tablespoon of olive oil, that's 120 calories. So it's very energy dense. Protein: chicken, fish, meat, eggs. We also find protein in grains like your breads and your crackers and vegetables, but much smaller amounts. And then lastly, the carbs. So breads, rice, crackers, you name it, the candies, the cakes, the cookies, the cereals, all of those are places where we find carbohydrate. And each of these three macronutrients has a very different impact on a person's blood sugar. There's a chart that we often use in some of our diabetes programs. Some of you may have seen it before, but it really illustrates the time and hours for a certain macronutrient to essentially convert to blood glucose. So this is a simplified chart. There's a lot of other factors that will dictate the speed at which this conversion occurs, as well as the available energy that's stored in the body. But essentially, you can see about 90% of what we consume in carbohydrate food choices is turning to glucose, and it'll peak in your bloodstream in about 1 to 2 hours. After about 2 hours, that carbohydrate has gone to where it needs to go, maybe stored in the muscles, transported to the liver, or maybe converted into fat for storage energy. Protein, a little bit more of a sustained impact on our blood glucose. So about 50% of it turns to glucose, and it peaks in about 2 to 4 hours. So that's why your protein food choices, if you've noticed and had a sit down to a nice cut of steak or chicken or fish, it sustains you a lot longer than just a simple mashed potatoes or rice or pasta. Because again, it takes a while to digest and get absorbed by the body. And then last, you have fat. So fat has a very minimal impact on blood sugar, but still about 10% of it can turn to glucose, and you can see where it begins to peak. So yes, carbohydrate does have the most significant impact on blood sugar, but it doesn't mean if you have diabetes, you have to avoid it. Okay. We need some of that carbohydrate fuel to get ourselves some energy, especially if we're very active. You're going to need a little bit more carbohydrate, but there really isn't an ideal percent. It's not, 50% carb, 25% protein, 25% fat. You'll talk to a lot of people who are very passionate about fitness programs, got to get their macros in, and they're very fixated on a specific macronutrient range for a variety of reasons. Who knows why? But with diabetes meal planning, there really isn't a magic ratio per se. It's all about what's going to be best for you to help you meet your health and well-being goals. So what we also see with carbohydrate food choices is that depending on what it is, whether it's a slice of white bread or wheat bread or baked potatoes versus mashed potatoes, there's such a wide range of effects on blood sugar. It's really tough to categorize them. Sometimes people will use a glycemic index, which is a measure of how quickly a single food item will push blood sugar up. But really, research on that as a tool for meal planning hasn't really shown any improvements in A1C. So it's one of those variables in meal planning that can be very confusing and is really unnecessary when we look at what's going to be sustainable for diabetes self-management. One of the things that we do know, and this is probably not a surprise to most of you, is that consuming regularly foods that are great sources of dietary fiber, so whole fruits instead of fruit juice, is also associated with lower all-cause mortality in persons with diabetes. So again, no real ideal percentage. I've seen doctors have their tear pad of low carbohydrate meal plans, but there's no evidence to say that there is a single macronutrient percentage that's going to work best for everybody. It's all about finding out where you are as an individual, what your goals are, and then seeing what needs to be manipulated to help you meet those goals. You can find carbohydrate information everywhere. Some of these sources are more reputable than others. A lot of your online meal trackers like MyFitnessPal and such are community driven. So that means people are individually keen in key entries and may not be as accurate. But overall, if you look at some of the carbohydrate levels that are mentioned in some of the more reputable websites, the .gov and the .edu websites that deal with diabetes and nutrition, you'll see some of these numbers firsthand. A cup of cooked pasta or rice, about 45 grams of carbohydrate. An 8-ounce glass of milk, 12 grams of carbohydrate. So you can see how quickly some of these foods can add up. If we look at rice and pasta, for example, those are probably, outside of bagels, are probably some of our more carbohydrate dense food choices, which is oftentimes why they get so vilified. People will say, you know what? you got to give up rice and pasta if you have diabetes. It's not that you have to give it up. You just have to be very mindful of that portion size, because since it's so concentrated in starch, it can elevate carbohydrate counts very quickly. Which brings us to a good lesson on the types of carbohydrates. So we've all seen these terms before: sugars, starches, and fiber. But if we take a step back and understand that sugars are typically converted to energy very quickly, simple chains of energy, whether they're monosaccharides or disaccharides. We're not going to go into a biochemistry lesson here. Whereas starches are essentially strings of sugars that are bound together and are oftentimes can be digested more slowly, but not a lot. Sometimes just white bread can be broken down for energy just as quickly as you can from an apple. Dietary fiber is an indigestible form of carbohydrate that doesn't really provide much energy, but it can slow down the impact on your blood sugar. And what we've seen is that whether it's sugars or starches, the total amount of carbohydrate is more impactful on your blood sugar than the source. Okay. If we take a closer look as we start to get into some of the food labeling jargon, and this is information that can help anybody depending on what you're working with. It's not exclusive to diabetes per se, but some of the common terms for sugar: sucrose, glucose, fructose, lactose. Those are examples of those mono and disaccharides. So they're broken down, converted to energy very quickly. Fructose is probably among the sweetest of these simple sugars. So you see that used a lot as a flavoring agent in some food choices. Solid sugars: your brown sugar, your cane sugar, your coconut sugar, your raw sugar, your refined sugar. It's all the same. Agave nectar, honey, corn syrups, and then your liquid sugars, your fruit juices and your fruit juice concentrates. So these all impact blood sugar. These all provide calories, and not one is more, quote, diabetes friendly, unquote, than another. Yes, some of them by themselves may have a slower impact on our blood sugar levels, but if we're combining them within other foods, it doesn't really matter. So again, try not to focus too much on the type of sugar, whether it's agave nectar or honey or table sugar or brown sugar. Focus on whichever one that you can use the least amount of, because no matter who you are, it's probably a good idea to limit added sugar intake. Which brings us to the food label. So if we look at food labels, there's a lot on there. Remember, it's mostly just marketing. Here's where I typically recommend to individuals. First, start with a list of ingredients. So there's no hard, fast rule that you should have a certain number of ingredients, and if it's above a certain number, you should put it away. Or if you can't pronounce it, you should put it back. I don't subscribe to any of that, but you should still understand what's in it. What am I getting in this particular food? You want to compare the serving size to your appetite. All of the numbers that you see on the food label are based on just that serving size. And then also look at the total carbs, okay, not just the sugars, total carbs. So sugar-free does not mean carb-free. So you might see, for example, a sugar-free pudding, which, could be a wise choice at a meal for a dessert, but it doesn't mean it's carb free. So if you eat it with, reckless abandon and end up having, 60 grams of carbohydrate from a sugar-free pudding, then you might be surprised to find that it'll still impact your blood sugar pretty significantly. When we look under carbs, you also want to check for dietary fiber, but really outside of that ingredient list and the nutrition facts, which we'll take a look at in a moment, the rest of it's just marketing. If you don't believe me in terms of marketing, look what I found for Cocoa Krispies. All right. So Cocoa Krispies, chocolately sweetened rice cereal, but hey, it will support your child's immunity. There you go. So again, just marketing. So let's take it a step further. So raise your hand anonymously. I think I'm the only one with my camera on, but that's okay. Raise your hand if you think veggie chips are something that are a good choice. Healthy choice. You can type it in the chat. That's fine. So again, I don't really categorize foods in terms of good, bad, healthy, unhealthy. I think it just makes things more confusing. But I am all about trying to help people make informed decisions. Okay. And again, when we look at veggie chips, the underlying message here is that this is a much better choice than potato chips because it has veggies in it. What looks good? Look at these. This particular bag, it's got spinach, got carrots, it's got tomatoes. Good for it. Okay. However, I encourage you next time you're at the grocery store to take a close look at the nutrition panel for both veggie chips and potato chips. You'll find that there's not much difference there. So again, there's nothing wrong with them as a snack, but if you're looking for a substitute for potato chips, I would just stick with potato chips because they're almost the same. I'll show you in a minute. But here are some other terms on the screen that you'll often see um, plastered on the front of packages, like no artificial flavors, all natural, non-GMO, multi-grain, made with whole ingredients. These really these are terms that don't have really any impact on health. And I will also say gluten-free can be somewhat irrelevant to if you are not gluten intolerant. So of course, if you have digestive concerns and gluten sensitive, then of course it is a big deal. But other than that, if you have no issues with wheat, rye, or barley, doesn't really mean much for you. So if we take a close look, I found this graphic that compares the nutrition facts for well-known branded chips compared to the health food veggie chips. You can do this yourself next time you're at the supermarket. You can see the calorie counts are very similar. And because of that, the fat and the carbohydrate counts are very similar. Cholesterol's both going to be zero. You only find cholesterol in animal foods. Okay, so unless you see any pet potato chips walking around, they're not going to ever have cholesterol. The only difference that we notice here is just a small sodium difference. And this is my take-home lesson to you when it comes to label reading. Find foods that your family is willing to eat, and then make your comparison among those food choices, and then try to pick the best choice among those that you're willing to eat. Because the key thing with nutrition, it's not good nutrition if nobody's going to eat it. So keep that in mind as you wrestle with some of these ingredient labels. The key things to be mindful of, especially for persons with diabetes, is going to be the carbohydrate count in that particular serving of food. So on that label, you'll see the serving size clearly measured, which will indicate the number of calories in that serving, as well as the other macronutrients, your fat, your carbs, your protein, and a percent daily value for a person who needs 2,000 calories a day. So that percentage may not necessarily apply to you, but at least gives you some good insight of how much a serving is of that particular food relative to that nutrient. Okay, so for example, this particular choice here has 10 grams of added sugar in 2/3 of a cup, which is pretty noteworthy. It's about 20% of a person's daily value in some examples. The other thing you'll notice on the food label that I wanted to call your attention to are other nutrients. So these are picked for a reason: vitamin D, calcium, iron, and potassium. Based on some survey data, these are nutrients of concern. Doesn't mean we're all deficient in it, but if you were to find somebody with a nutrition deficiency in our country, chances are one of these four, if not all of them, might be on that list. So you don't necessarily need to have a super dose of any of these, but these are some nutrients that we often find could be deficient in a person's diet. So the next thing I want to address is we talk about meal planning and closing out with some practical steps here on how to put it into reality is portion size. So again, there's your portion size is going to differ from one person's to the next person based on how much energy you need. People on this call might need anywhere from 1,200 to 3,200 calories each day, depending on your activity level and your health and wellness goals. If we look at some general ideas for portion sizes for persons with diabetes, and we use our hands, that I've found probably to be the most consistent way to at least estimate what you're getting. Let's say you saw in that chart that a cup of rice or a cup of pasta, that's 45 grams of carbohydrate, and your doctor or healthcare team says, you know what, you should probably keep it to about 45 to 60 grams per meal. So you can use your fist. So that's about 1 cup in most instances. And then your thumb, that's about an ounce. So if you're trying to get an ounce of cheese, that would be the size of your thumb, or maybe a small handful of popcorn or some snack crackers. That would also be about an ounce or so net weight. So some ideas to really give you an idea of what it looks like. So again, not saying that that's all you can ever eat is just this much pasta or this much popcorn, but understanding the numbers relative to 1 ounce, 1 cup, half a cup, 1 teaspoon, and so forth, relative to some common visual examples. So planning meals. So why do I need to do it? Okay. Why do we need to plan meals? It's one of the things that I've found that can be the most challenging, but it's also the number one impediment to getting people to eat more healthfully. With individuals with diabetes, planning meals helps us maintain normal blood glucose, can help provide a more reasonable amount of calories, but I've found that it also helps limit the takeout splurges, because if you're on the go and you're not giving any attention to what you're going to eat even this evening, there's a greater likelihood that you might be in a drive-through window or getting DoorDash sent to your house. When you're doing that, it's going to make it more challenging to improve your health because you are no longer in control of your own nutrition. We already know about the portion sizes in a lot of our takeout and restaurant meals are much larger, but also so are the added fats and added salt. So by limiting takeout splurges and planning your meals, you can go a long way at improving numerous outcomes, not just individuals with diabetes. Of course, we can't talk about eating without talking about snacks. We all like to snack. Timed right, snacks are a big part of a healthy diet. Just to give you some numbers from a digestion and physiological standpoint, if you had a healthy meal, it's going to take about 3 to 4 hours to digest, because remember the combination of those nutrients, the carbs, the fats, the protein, about 3 to 4 hours. So a sensible snack could hold you over until your next meal, provided that you had an adequate meal at that juncture. So if you're finding yourself hungry 2 hours after eating, it might be a reflection of what you had before. Didn't have enough protein, didn't have enough fiber. Maybe it was a little bit too low in fat. Fat, protein, and fiber are the three nutrients that can help hold us over the longest. So when we look at snacks, try to look for those that are providing some combination of nutrients that you need. We talked about protein and fiber, but examples like Greek yogurt, very good protein source, string cheese, good protein source, veggie sticks, the real veggies, not the chips, but carrots and celery dipped in hummus, fresh fruit, popcorn, mini granola bars. Again, the common denominators here is a little bit of carbohydrate, if any at all, but also protein and fiber. Trying to select those snacks that are low in added sugar, low in added fats are helpful because they're very calorie dense and can be making weight management much more challenging. But always ask yourself, are you truly hungry? Or are you just eating because you saw it somewhere or can you smell it somewhere? A lot of these cravings will pass very quickly if you give it time. Just remember asking yourself, am I really hungry? And if what I'm about to select here, is it giving me really any nutritional benefit? One of the very common tools that's used for meal planning is the plate method. So you've seen the My Plate in several government publications, the grains, the fruits, the vegetables, the protein. The diabetes method is not much different, but it's essentially taking your plate and splitting it in half. One half of that plate would consist of non-starchy vegetables, so green beans, broccoli, cauliflower, a lot of your salad items. Then the other half is split again between whole grains and starches and protein food. So just like on the example you see on the screen there, you got a little bit of mashed potatoes, a little bit of what looks to be chicken, alongside a much larger portion of green beans. On the side, a little bit of low-fat dairy if you'd want, or a serving of fruit. So that particular plate, how it's set up, if you're to have the dairy and the fruit and the starchy vegetables, you're probably looking about 2 or 3 servings of carbohydrate food. Okay. Under most nutritional guidelines, that's a good start in most cases. So it's not low in carb, it's more conservative with carbs. And that's our number one take home message for meal planning with diabetes. Just be aware, low carb is not necessary, but still, prudent to try to keep a close eye on how much you're including. And if you want specific numbers, talk to your healthcare team. This is not a diet prescription per se. When choosing carbohydrates, try to prioritize those that are rich in dietary fiber. So more whole grains versus refined, so 100% whole wheat bread versus white bread, and wild or brown rice versus white rice. When possible, I think the presence of fiber, besides helping blunt the blood sugar response, makes it a little bit more difficult to overeat because that fiber is promoting that feeling of fullness. With meal planning, it's also important to try to eat regularly. This will help you keep your blood sugars under better control, and also very important if you're on insulin. So insulins can peak at different times of the day depending on which one you're using. So if you're going long periods of time without eating while taking insulin, you'd be at greater risk of hypoglycemia. Another take-home message, not getting bogged down with food label jargon, trying to keep junk out of the house, the ultra-processed snack foods, and using your plate as a guide, and remembering that help is available. So most of you on a health plan as part of UF or UF Health have access to a registered dietitian who can sit down with you and talk about individualized approaches to meal planning to meet your needs, and understanding that there's more than one right answer out there. Lots of information about diabetes in general. It's always important to consider the source. And one of the better sources I've found is at diabetes.org. At diabetes.org, you'll find cross links to several other nutrition websites. One of them is the Diabetes Food Hub. So diabetesfoodhub.org, if you can remember that. That is a very good website. It has a good catalog of nutritional information. You can sort by ingredients. You can sort by type of cuisine. You can sort by serving size. If you're cooking for just one, it'll make a grocery list for you. So again, it's one of many online recipe tools that are out there. But this one I think is a little bit more beneficial for persons with diabetes because it gives a nutrition breakdown too. So as I said, I've talked very quickly, covered a lot of ground. Questions do arise. Any questions that you have that you think of later on, say, oh, you know what? I wish I would have asked this. Just remember our email address. I'd put my name up there, but jonathan.vredenberg@ufhealth.org. That's hard to spell. But if you can just remember wellness@jax.ufl.edu, that's a good way to reach us as well. So I'm going to go through the chat and see if I can get to some of these questions here.
Yeah, I wrote them down. So the first one that came through, if you could talk a little bit more about the low glycemic index and how you can use it to create balanced meals.
Okay, so the glycemic index, by definition, is the rate of digestion and absorption of a carbohydrate food item. So every carbohydrate food item has a specific glycemic index number attached to it. So something like carrots could be, I mean, I don't have all memorized off the top of my head, but fruits and vegetables in their whole form are typically a lower glycemic index versus something like a fruit juice or table sugar, which has a higher glycemic index number. What I was saying is that research has shown that that is not an effective tool to use for meal planning. So it wasn't really advocating using it at all. I was just trying to kind of clarify the definition, if that makes sense.
We also have a question from Ryan. He's an extension agent who works on nutrition education. He says that he often deals with people who want to make dietary changes, but they don't always take consistent action, which can be disheartening. And if you have any advice or insight on how to better influence behavior in a sustainable and healthy way.
Oh, if I could do it in a sustainable way, I'd be a billionaire. So I think so that's a great question, and one that there's unfortunately not a simple answer to, but things that seem to be effective in those populations where we see a lot of backsliding, if you will. Remember, we change, in stages. We kind of move through the progression there of pre-contemplation, contemplation, action, and so to speak. And what I found that helps kind of nurture and sustain that change is first making small changes piece by piece, but also having a support system in place. So whether it's a colleague, a family member, basically an accountability partner, so that somebody is always going to be kind of coaching you along and holding you when you need to be pulled or pushing when you need to be pushed, but also vice versa. So I think trying to enlist the help of a colleague or a counselor or a coach. So again, it could be It could be a peer-to-peer type situation, or it could be a health coach to a patient type situation. But those are some of the things I've found that have worked the most effectively. Secondly, also looking at that person's environment. It's very difficult to make sustainable nutritional changes if you're continuously exposing yourself to food choices that aren't going to be on your radar, if you will. And this is something that I see oftentimes when a single family member, let's say the the mother or the father in a family unit is asking for nutrition advice, and they're the only ones making the changes to the way they eat instead of getting the entire family involved. So again, all nutrition, wholesale nutrition changes that target trying to help us lead healthier lives, they can, and the whole family could be beneficial. So trying to get more people along for the ride, I think, is one of the things that can be successful.
Okay. And the last one I have is, what is your opinion on adding fiber supplements to your diet?
Not a big fan. The research with that isn't really, it's pretty much equivocal, meaning it's just adding fiber for the benefit of fiber. I think you have a greater chance of having a lot more digestive feedback doing it that way versus trying to get it in whole foods. It tastes much better if you eat it from an apple or a slice of whole grain bread with a little bit of butter on there. It'd be a much better way to get it in my opinion, than the fiber supplements. So there's not so much that we are fiber deficient, it's that we're over selecting refined grain foods. So trying to having a diet that's filled with refined grains, the white breads, the white crackers and such, and then augmenting it with fiber supplements isn't going to do you any favors. It's trying to make sure that the food choices that you select have good sources of dietary fiber.
Sarah says, I heard food combination helps with blood sugar spikes, like a small apple with a serving of cheese or natural peanut butter. Is there any truth to that?
Yeah, there is some truth. It hasn't been consistently studied or demonstrated, but yeah, anytime you can pair together some food choices where you have, again, if you look at that graph that shows the impact of just carbohydrate foods on blood sugar, having something else to complement it, like the peanut butter on the apple or a piece of cheese, can help blunt that response. But what we haven't seen is that eh, does that improve A1C levels or health outcomes. We don't know, but it is a way to get in some additional nutrients. So if you can, um, I would go for it, but I wouldn't. Don't let that derail your goal of picking up an apple if you don't have any peanut butter handy, if that makes sense.
Okay. Um, are there any over-the-counter supplements that you would recommend to take in helping control blood sugar level?
Not really. I mean, the only supplements I would recommend if would be any ones that you may be deficient in, whether it's an iron supplement for a young female or a calcium supplement for somebody who's not getting in a lot of calcium-rich foods. But again, it's more on a case-by-case basis. There isn't a whole lot of data to support that diabetes in and of itself could benefit from an extra supplement. You see things thrown out there like cinnamon, for example, and those extracts have been shown in some small studies to help with, you know, blood sugar management, but it hasn't been consistently shown to be effective. And a lot of our dietary supplements aren't regulated the same way as drugs. So sometimes you're not always getting what's on the label. So I usually try to be very selective with dietary supplements and recommending them at all.
What are your thoughts on nutritional yeast?
As far as what, I guess would be the follow-up question. I mean, can use it in your recipes and
Michelle, do you
um,
wanna like unmute yourself? You wanna ask?
Hello.
Hey.
Yeah, like just the stuff that it has with the vitamins and stuff like that. Does it hurt? Does it help? The total carbs are 2 tablespoons is the serving size. I
yeah,
just
it doesn't really hurt. I think a lot of people use it on the
This is Kristen
on the context of a fermented foods and supporting a healthy gut. That's oftentimes where you might see it. But outside of that, yeah, it wouldn't hurt. I would just put it that way. But I don't think it offers anything therapeutic.
Okay. Can you share with us again who we can reach out to for dietitian diet help?
Well, I would look in your health plan. So if you're on Gator Care, on the Gator Care plan, we do have a dietitian on our staff, Dana Gardner. She provides individualized nutrition counseling. If you're outside the Gator Care family, I would reach back to your HR and benefits specialist. Most of the health plans do have the recommended network dietitians, or might also work aside your physician. So if you're part of if you're seeing an endocrinologist for diabetes care, there's a good chance that he or she is connected with a dietitian that can provide some individualized counseling too, and it's usually covered 100% as well.
Okay. Are there any groups or a website you would recommend that tackle diabetes from a cultural perspective? My husband was recently diagnosed and he's Indian. It's been difficult to cook meals he enjoys based on his doctor's recommendations.
So it's funny you mention that, because one of the facets of that diabetes food hub is you can also break it down by cuisine and food preferences. So that'd be one to start with.
Perfect, thank you. So your conclusion is no supplement useful for lower blood sugar?
Correct.
Let's see, any other questions? Or anything else you would like to add, John, before we sign off?
No, that's it. Thank you everybody for having some real good questions. And there's a lot of information out there with diabetes. So if anything else comes to mind, you can shoot me an email on that address on the screen. The answers vary based on the individual, so it's tough to get universal recommendations. But I think the key approach is trying to understand that the eating plans for living healthy with diabetes really aren't any different than the eating plans for anyone to eat healthy, live healthy. So that's something to keep in mind. So it doesn't require a special type of grocery or a special food choice. It's just being aware, and specifically being aware of how carbohydrate can impact blood sugar, and then how your medications that you're using, because if you're on insulin or if you're on oral agents, then that could impact your meal planning approaches too. But again, that's where talking with an individual person can kind of understand your personal health needs.
Okay, well, thank you so much, John, and thank you everyone for having joined us today. This webinar was recorded and it will be uploaded on our YouTube channel in the coming weeks, so you can always reference back the information that you heard. Thank you, everybody, and have a good day.